Somewhere in the cemetery directly in front of me now on Hunkpapa Avenue on the reservation is the grave of Rain in the Face. And Rain in the Face was involved with some of the earlier fights like the Fetterman Massacre, and his name was taken because as a child he went into battle with the Cheyenne. Now the later Cheyenne would come to ally with him at places like the Fetterman Massacre, but when this battle happened he got blood all over his face. And it was said that during a battle in Montana with another tribe, he emerged victorious with rain coming down heavily, and that reinforced his name. And during the 1870s, he was arrested by Thomas Custer and ordered to jail. Either it was sympathetic Indian agents, or by his own volition he escaped, and he made it a point to join General Sitting Bull, or Chief Sitting Bull rather. And when he went to the Battle of Little Bighorn, it's said that he had personal vendetta against Thomas Custer for ordering what he saw as an unlawful arrest. He was engaged in regular warfare with settlers encroaching on his land. So when he saw Thomas Custer at the battle, it said that he killed him and pulled his heart out as a trophy of war. On his deathbed, although he always denied killing General Custer himself, on his deathbed he did confess to the priest that he believed he may have shot Custer so close that the gunpowder speckled his face. And I think it's telling that the priest, who was supposed to keep these confessions secret, made this publicly available knowledge, but this was something that he carried with him for the rest of his life. Somewhere behind me now is the grave of Long Wolf, and not much is known about Long Wolf himself, although it is known with pretty good certainty that he was born in 1833, and what we do know for sure is that he participated in the Battle of Little Bighorn, where he was victorious against Colonel Custer's forces. And a little while later, he joined up with Wild Buffalo Bill and went over on a tour of Europe. And during this tour, he became sick in London and died. And his wife was very worried that they would dump his body overboard and give him a burial at sea. And so she arranged for him to be buried in Brompton Cemetery. Now, Buffalo Bill himself and his wife made sure that his gravestone had the image of a long wolf on it. And in 1997, somebody who became aware of his story in England decided to help repatriate his remains back here to South Dakota, to his homeland. And when they did the autopsy on him after his death, there was some question as to whether or not he had participated in these battles. But the autopsy found that he had a number of bullet scars on his body, as well as saber wounds. So it was pretty obvious that the fighting that he participated in was close hand-to-hand fighting. So the people who had said that he was lying about his military service and his participation in the Indian Wars were proven wrong. But it is fascinating to me because Long Wolf became renowned as this great warrior who never really talked at length about how brutal these battles were, a fact that was only really discovered after his death during the autopsy. I haven't been able to find Long Wolf's grave in this cemetery, although most references say that he is buried in this cemetery. And the story of Long Wolf, then, is the story of someone who fought valiantly for his own people and then fought to promote their image overseas at the Wild West shows, actually showing how the Native Americans truly lived. He lived with his family, he wore his war dress, and the story of a man who took 100 years to return back, or over 100 years. He died in 1892, and he was only returned in 1997. Behind me is the grave of Chief Spotted Tail, or in his native tongue, Sintigleska, and he was a chief, a non-hereditary chief, but a chief chosen for his leadership of the Brule branch of the Lakota people. And he was chosen because of his honesty and his prowess in battle, and his battle skills were proven in a couple of fights with the Pawnee, and he also raided a couple of wagon trains. And in 1865, when Spotted Kettle's camp was attacked by U.S. soldiers, he launched a retaliatory raid. And eventually, when Red Cloud went to Washington, D.C. in the 1870s, he accompanied him and became a great Native American statesman and a champion of the rights for the rural people. However, when Red Cloud began, or he helped also negotiate the surrender of American Horse. And when this happened, a lot of people started thinking that he was siding more with the settlers and with the whites than he was with the native people. And this created a stir within the Brule Lakota tribe. And it was said that he was murdered because the rumor was that he was sleeping with somebody else's wife or attempting to take their wife. But it is now commonly accepted by historians that someone wanted to unseat him as the head of the tribe, of the Lakota tribe here. And this was kind of an easy way to do it, just accuse him of trying to take your wife and kill him. But he was a very powerful later member of the Lakota chiefdom. Behind me is the grave of Chief Sitting Bull, who was born only a few miles to the west. And after fighting against American expansionism for many years, or rather against European expansionism for many years, he had a vision in which he saw hundreds of blue-clad cavalrymen falling from the sky and landing in a Lakota camp. And only 3 weeks later, in 1876, they had their victory against Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And Custer's battalion was entirely wiped out. There were no survivors. And following this, thousands of troops came into the area, and the Lakota under Sitting Bull were forced to flee to Canada. And they remained there until 1881 when they came back. Now in 1890, there was a religious craze starting amongst all of the tribes on the Great Plains, which was started in what is now Nevada around the Pyramid Reservation. But this was the ghost dance religion. It led to the massacre at Wounded Knee, and the ghost dance religion, the U.S. authorities feared that it would revitalize the Native American people, and because they feared that he would be a proponent of this religion, they confined him to a part of a fort. And in a scuffle, he refused to be moved, and two of the Indian agents shot him, one in the side and one in the head. So this is considered by most people to be an assassination motivated by religion and ethnic violence. But Sitting Bull remained in the cemetery of that post for decades until in 1950, around that time, his family exhumed him and brought him here. Although other stories say that his body was brought back to Turtle Mountain on the US-Canada border, where it remains to this day in an unmarked grave. Of the protests happening on the Standing Rock Reservation, I wondered why they called it Standing Rock, and the reason is here behind me in front of the Administrative Center at Fort Yates. And the Standing Rock is said to have been a woman and her child which turned to stone. A cloud formed around them and they solidified. And for centuries, this Standing Rock was moved from Lakota to Dakota to Arikara villages. And right before his death, Chief Sitting Bull issued a sort of decree that it should remain in place. It should no longer roam with the people, but it should be put up on a pedestal in front of Fort Yates, and that it should never be moved. And over these decades, it has stayed here as parking lots and more modern buildings have been built around it. buried in the cemetery behind me is Chief Gall, who was a military advisor to Sitting Bull at both the Battle of Little Bighorn and a number of other skirmishes in the Indian Wars. And I think that it's important to note that he is something that was called a Hunkpapa Lakota, and there were 7 different sort of tribes or confederations within the Lakota people, but the Hunkpapa, that means the center of the circle, and it was called that because traditionally when these 7 confederated tribes would meet, they would form the entrance building to the sort of fortified structure that you would go into, signifying that they were the greatest warriors. Now, he is called Gall because he attempted to eat the gall of an animal which he had killed as a young boy, and later after the war, they brought him into the fold of a peaceful Native Americans. So he did go up with Sitting Bull to Canada, and in 1881 he came back and he spent the rest of his days as a peaceful farmer. And he is buried up on the hill behind me overlooking the Episcopal Church directly ahead of me. I'm here at Fort Robinson, and behind me is the main fort of Fort Robinson, to tell the story of one of the most interesting and fierce fighters of the entire American Indian War. His name was Crazy Horse, and he surrendered here on May 5th, 1877. And he was one of the last head figures of the war to surrender here, and he was involved from the very start of the war at the Fetterman fight all the way over to the Battle of Little Bighorn just shortly prior. And he decided to surrender himself along with several other warriors to an officer at the post behind me, and for a period of time he lived in a village close by. This is a sort of similar state of affairs as the Apaches who surrendered and lived close to the post in their own village, and this was the Red Cloud Agency at the time. And his life went on for a short period of time, but he drew a lot of sort of animosity from people who had surrendered before him, from people like Red Cloud, and I believe a couple other Spotted Tail, and people like this who had for a while already adapted to the white way of life and surrendered quite a while ago. So the fact that he held out so long and was respected very much as a worthy adversary drew a lot of ire from his own compatriots. So Crazy Horse lived in the nearby Red Cloud Indian Agency close to Fort Robinson for about 4 months. And then in August of 1877, some of his compatriots who were jealous of the respect he was getting started to spread rumors that he had a desire to escape and go continue the fight and practice his traditional way of life, something which they were very afraid of because they thought that there would be another uprising which would re-spark the Indian Wars. And so there was the Nez Perce at the same time, and the news had reached the cavalry that Chief Joseph had led his men out of the reservation up through Montana, and they were making their way towards Canada. And this posed a grave threat because a lot of tribes made their way up towards Canada, and there was a fear that they would move back down into the territory south of there and rekindle the Indian Wars. And so immediately, Crazy Horse became an object of intrigue, and they were worried that he was going to start a revolt. So translations were taking place, and they went to Crazy Horse and they said, "Will you help the U.S. Army? Join our side in the fight against the Nez Perce." And Crazy Horse said, "Absolutely not. I have agreed to surrender on terms of peace, and I will not fight the Nez Perce." However, the translator said that Crazy Horse said, "I will fight until every white man is dead." And this obviously was a wrong translation, and somebody confronted him with it and said, "You're translating that completely wrong." And another version of the story says, "I'll join you and help fight until every Nez Perce is dead." But either way, he did not pledge to fight against the white man. He either pledged total peace or to fight the Nez Perce on the side of the white man. But tension was rising, and they started believing that Crazy Horse was going to escape and either join the Nez Perce or kill the whites or go to Canada and start the Indian Wars again from the north. And this really marked the end of Crazy Horse's life as a free or as a living man. And so the US Army and the cavalry believed that Crazy Horse was going to initiate a rebellion, and that he was a very complicated asset. He could either be used to help us or hurt us, but the tides were turning and we believed that he was going to turn against us and escape. And so we ordered him to be brought under cover of darkness from the Red Cloud Agency to the division headquarters of Fort Robinson behind me. And under cover of darkness, they placed him inside of one of the barracks, and he scuffled with the guard on duty as well as another Native American man, and the guard on duty bayoneted him in the chest. And as he lay dying, he refused to lie down in a white man's bed. He said, "Let me lie on the floor." And when he had finally passed away, his parents brought his body up to Fort Sheridan and put it on a traditional burial platform. And eventually, nobody knows what happened to his body, but it's believed that he was buried somewhere in the Black Hills, which remains very, very sacred to the Lakota people.